I've been doing a survey of the Hebrew Bible, looking at each book and how basically the basic overall outline of each book and how it is put together. Looking at the introduction, followed then by a basic overall contents of the book. So we begin now with Obadiah or Obadiah. The book is named after its author, Obadiah, meaning the servant or worshiper of the Lord. There are 13 men in the Old Testament with the same name, but there is no evidence that the prophet Obadiah can be identified with any of the other men hearing that bear his name. We're just not sure. Some genealogical data is not given, or since I should say genealogical data is not given, which would have suggested that he was of a royal line. He is no doubt of humble circumstances. In writing concerning the silence of his background and person, Pusey, E.B. Pusey, well writes, "The silence of Holy Scripture as to the prophet Obadiah stands in remarkable contrast with the anxiety of men to know something of him. They hoped that Obadiah might prove to have been the faithful protector of the prophet under Ahab, or the son of the Shunammite, whom Elijah called to life in 1 Kings 17, or the Obadiah whom Jehoshaphat sent to teach in the cities of Judah, 2 Chronicles 17:7, or the Levite who was selected with one other to be the overseer set over the repair of the temple in the reign of Josiah, 2 Chronicles 14:12. Fruitless guesses at what God has hidden. God has willed that his name alone and the brief prophecy should be known in this world. One of the things that I would say, as I have thought about that it was not a concern of God to have knowledge of who it was. He used a faithful servant who never had his name in lights. It says to me that often in life, the main purpose, if we're following Christ, is to be faithful to him. We may never be known in this world, but that's not the issue. The issue is fidelity to the Lord, which Obadiah was willing to do. And like I say, we don't know who he was. And so it's not important about having our name in lights. What is important is being faithful to what the Lord has called each one of us to do for him. As to the author, again, while as usual, often critical study has sought to disrupt the unity of the book, it is nevertheless done on, I believe, unsubstantial ground. Young correctly summarizes the fact that Obadiah is the one author whom he says, we would assert that it is best to regard the entire prophecy as having been written by Obadiah and that he lived before Jeremiah. As to the date, among conservative scholarship, the date for the book of Obadiah is either during the reign of Jehoram, around 1848 to 1841 BC, and this is in 2 Chronicles 21, 16, and 17, when Edom revolted, or possibly during the Babylonian invasion of 586 BC. This is in 2 Kings 25, based upon Psalm 137, verse 7, and Ezekiel 35. Support for the latter date comes basically from Psalm 137 and Ezekiel 35, and then may be stated as follows. First, Psalm 137, in speaking of the Babylonian invasion, gives the words of the Edomites during this event: raise it, raise it. Also, in Ezekiel, in relation to the same event, judgment is pronounced on Edom because you have had a perpetual hatred, the text says, and you have shed the blood of the children of Israel by the force of the sword in the time of their calamity, in the time when their iniquity had an end. And then also, the fact that Edom rejoiced at Israel's calamity is recorded elsewhere in Ezekiel chapter 35, verse 15. And it is parallel with Obadiah chapter 12. Finally, since Jeremiah 49, 7 to 22 is like Obadiah 1:9, it is suggested that Obadiah may have referred to him in his prophecy, and this would demand a later date or composition. While the late date has its support, the earlier date is also not lacking in good solid support either. It seems that more concrete evidence can be given for the earlier date, and these may be analyzed as follows. According to 2 Kings 8:20, for example, Edom revolted in the reign of Jehoram, and it seems was allied to her neighbors, Philistia and Arabia, who attacked Jerusalem during his reign. This is in 2 Chronicles 21, 16 to 17, compare with Obadiah 11. According to Joel 3, 3 to 6, Philistia cast lots for the Jews and carried away captives from Jerusalem. Joel was written between 835 and 830 BC, and this closely parallels Obadiah 11 and 12. Excuse me. Furthermore, as we look at this earlier date, Amos in 1:6 affirms or confirms the same fact that he wrote years before the Babylonian captivity. Verse 13 of Obadiah also, when correctly translated, seems to have a clear reference to a yet future transgression, which would seem to necessitate a yet future destruction of Jerusalem, probably that of the Babylonian invasion. And then, finally, to insist that Obadiah followed Jeremiah's prophecy is unwarranted. Rather, it is more probable, since Obadiah is more abrupt and short, that Jeremiah might have used Obadiah and made his abruptness smoother and more lucid. So the date, it's just hard to be dogmatic, whether it was the earlier date or during the reign of Jehoram, or whether we're talking about the Babylonian captivity of 586 BC. In terms of the historical background, the background for the book actually begins in the book of Genesis with the story of Jacob and Esau, Genesis 25:24, to 34:27. Despising his birthright, Esau flippantly bartered it away to Jacob in order to momentarily satisfy his appetite. Despising his birthright was in effect despising God for Esau to do that. Hereafter, he was given the name Edom, and from that point throughout the history of his descendants, the Edomites were in constant conflict with Israel. They rejected the permission of Moses to pass through the land in Numbers 20:14-20. They opposed King Saul in 1 Samuel 14:47. They fought against David in 1 Kings 11:15-16. They opposed Solomon, seen in 1 Kings 11:14-23, and Jehoshaphat, 2 Chronicles 20:22, and they rebelled or revolted against Jehoram in 2 Chronicles 21:8. When the Philistines and Arabians were pillaging the Israelites in the city, the Edomites then rejoiced at their spoiling, which would have been dated, if we're taking the earlier date, 848 to 841 BC. And they participated in it, and hence God, according to Obadiah, is ready to judge them. The Edomites settled in Mount Seir, a mountainous region south of the Dead Sea. The area of Edom extended for about 30 miles in width and 100 miles in length, and was characterized by fertile land and valleys. Petra was the capital, with a narrow entrance of a 12 to 20-foot canyon between towering mountain walls of 200 to 250 feet high. In places, these mountain walls almost touched, so that to ride beside one another in pairs of horsemen was almost impossible. The city itself was circled by a high ring of mountains, nestled far enough into these mountains to make them practically unconquerable. The mountains were rough, rocky heights reaching as high as 47 or 4,780 feet above sea level beside Petra. And the people lived in homes carved in the sides of the rock or mountain. It is little wonder then that this elevated and secure position that the Edomites had caused them to boast, "Who shall bring me down to the ground?" We see this in verse 3. Now, as to the purpose of the book. The purpose of the book is to predict the destruction of Edom and to draw a constant contrast, or to draw a contrast between their destruction and the deliverance of Israel in the future. Edom, although in kinship with Israel, dealt treacherously with her, and the Lord is announcing their judgment and destruction that would take place. The prophet sets forth a cry against Edom in verses 1 to 4, giving the character and cause of their destruction in verses 5 to 14. The book then looks beyond Edom to the final judgment of all the enemies of Israel in the day of the Lord, and to the character of Israel's restoration and blessing in the final restoration of the eternal kingdom that would be established in New Testament theology at the return of Christ. The argument or the flow of thought of the book. The theme of the book of Obadiah is the doom and downfall of Edom. The book divides nicely into two major sections. The doom of Edom, 1 to 16, and the deliverance that God would bring to Israel, 17 to 21. In the first section, the writer discusses the announcement of Edom's doom, verses 1 to 9, the indictment of Edom, 10 to 14, and finally her sentence of judgment is given along with its consequent result, verses 15 to 17. As the prophet announces Edom's doom, he gives the certainty of its fulfillment. The words are given in spite of Edom's natural rock protection and her arrogant pride. The announcement of a sure judgment is followed by a description then of the completeness of her doom, giving the effects of her treasures, her wise men, and her mighty men. Her treasures will be sought out, her wise men destroyed, and her mighty men dismayed and cut off by God's judgment. Following this announcement of judgment, Obadiah discusses the indictment of Yahweh against Edom in verses 10 to 14. She is indicted for her violence and hostility against Judah, for her exultation over Judah's destruction, for stealing from Judah, for preventing Judah's fugitives from escaping their enemies, and for the actual apprehension and betrayal of Judah's refugees. Because of these evils, Edom is sentenced to God's judgment. The book then concludes in the final section with God's future deliverance for Israel. Israel will be saved and see the victory over all that she has passed through with the invasion of Edom, whether we're talking about this or what happens during the Babylonian captivity, whether we're talking about under Jehoram or later. Israel then would be promised a return to her land, and the kingdom of the Lord would then be established on Mount Zion. So this is basically the book of Edom, one chapter discussing God's judgment on Edom for blocking the passageway of the Israelites when there was the invasion against her. And it could well fit not only in the early date, but also with the Babylonian invasion that occurred. And then God's promise of deliverance after that. And as I look at the New Testament, it is interesting that in the New Testament, when we think of a book, for example, like Isaiah 34 and 35, applying it then in New Testament, Edom can become a type of the world system that seeks to destroy the church. But the good news is Christ said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And so in that eternal kingdom, someday, the Lord will reign as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And all believers, we could say spiritual Israel, all believers, Jew and Gentile, who have their faith rooted in Jesus Christ, will reign in that eternal Mount Zion, that eternal Jerusalem of a new heaven and new earth. So there's a lot of lessons, I think, in the book of Obadiah. The one thing that strikes me, though, is here's a man that was unknown. And yet God chose to allow his book to be part of the canon of Scripture. And so it says to us that we should be faithful. It's not a matter of how many people applaud us or how widely known we are, but we're to toil in the Lord, knowing that our toil is not in vain in the Lord, as Paul said.